Mrs. Nathan's eyebrows went up. Nothing? My goodness, Jake, you shouldn't have interrupted Carol. But maybe you should tell us one thing you didn't like. I said the whole story was stupid and boring, and I didn't like it at all. Well, said Mrs. Nathan. How about the rest of you? Is there anyone else who didn't like the story? I looked around, and almost every kid's hand went up in the air. And I thought, hey, look, I'm a leader. They agree with me, and they can see that I'm not the teacher's pet. Hurrah! Mrs. Nathan looked around, and then she looked at me, and she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. And I thought, uh-oh, now I'm going to get it. Then she smiled at me, and she said, Jake, you are so right. I didn't like this story very much either. That's all. Teach me to pay more attention to what's good and what's not. So let's keep ahead in our reading books, all the way to page 287. We were flipping pages. While we were flipping pages, Mrs. Nathan said, Now, this is a longer story, so you won't have time to finish it during reading time. But you can take it home and finish it tonight. I hope you'll like this story better, because, like Jake says, a story should never be boring or stupid. Right now, I want everyone to take out a piece of paper and write down 3 ways you think Tom's pet crow could be better. All around the class, kids were groaning and giving me dirty looks, because now we had to do some writing, and we had homework, and it was all my fault. Plus, Mrs. Nathan was still smiling at me and saying how smart I was, and I was starting to wonder, how bad do I have to be make her stop treating me like her little sweetie pie? Because being bad isn't as easy as some kids make it look. A little later during art class, Miss Scott came over and looked at the painting I was making for Mother's Day. She stood there a minute, and then she said, Jake, that is so sweet. I think that's just about the sweetest Mother's Day painting I've ever seen. Before art, I didn't know how I was going to be bad in Miss Scott's class, but when she said that, I knew just what to do. I grabbed the bottom of my painting and I pulled the paper out of the clips on the easel. I ripped it up and I said, well, I think it's a rotten painting, real loud. And then I grabbed the little brush and been using and I snapped it right in half. Miss Scott stood there with her mouth open. Every kid in the class was looking at her, waiting for an explosion. Then she took a deep breath and sat down in a chair. She started nodding her head. Then, in a soft voice, she said, Class, I want you all to pay attention, which is something she didn't need to say. She was still nodding her head. I thought she was going to start screaming any second. She looked around at the class and said, Jake has just been very brave. You see, I said I liked his painting, and what did Jake do? He tore it up. He knows he can do better work than that, and he's not afraid to tear up his work and start over. Jake, I think you might be the best art student in this whole school. And then Miss Scott smiled at me like I had just painted the Mona Lisa or something. So art class was a bust. I was still the teacher's pet. One of Mr. Collins' big roses never swing on the ropes. So what did I do? At the beginning of gym class, I swung on the ropes and I yelled, "Yahoo!" while I was doing it. And when Mr. Collins came through the doorway and saw me, what did he do? Did he come and grab me? Did he shake his first fist at me? No, he grinned. Then he said, "I was wondering who would be the first kid to break that rule this year. I loved a kid who's got some spirit, some backbone. The rest of you kids could take a lesson for Drake here. Okay, Trooper, off that rope and give me 5 push-ups. And the next kid who swings will do 30 push-ups and 30 sit-ups. So the rest of you don't get any ideas." Then at lunch, when I handed the orange belt to Mrs. Carp and said, "I don't want to wear this anymore, and I get in trouble." No, Mrs. Carp patted me on the head and announced something to everyone in the cafeteria. She smiled at me and said Jake Drake was being very unselfish. She said Jake Drake wanted to share the fun of wearing the lunch patrol belt with someone else. And then she gave the belt to Ben Grumson, who did not smile at me. And no one was happy with me during afternoon math time either, because we all had to do 3 worksheets instead of using the computers because of me. So by the end of school on Wednesday afternoon, I was ready to give up. All day I had been about as bad as and rude as I knew how to be, and it hadn't done any good. I was still the teacher's pet, every teacher's pet. After school, as I got on the bus, this wave of lemon smell rolled down the stairs at me. Then I saw 3 yellow air fresheners hanging from the back of the driver's seat. Before I could get past her, the bus driver grabbed me and gave me a big hug. She said, "After what you said this morning, well, I went right out and bought these things for the bus. And when I went to take care of my little grandson today, he climbed up on my lap and he said, 'Grandma smells good. Isn't that the cutest thing you ever heard?' Then the lady hugged me again, with everyone watching, and she said, 'You're still my favorite little passenger. No doubt about it.' I had a one-way ticket to Pittsville. Wednesday night I had a dream. I was in a cage, a little wire cage in a room. I was on my hands and knees. There were 2 balls inside my cage. One of them was filled with Cheerios, and the other one had root beer. Every once in a while, I would bend down and eat a mouthful of cereal, and then lick up some root beer. All around me there were little cages with other kids in them. Mark was in one, and Ben Gronson, and there was Masha and Carl, even Willie. All of us were munching cereal and lapping up soda. Then this tall lady came into the room. She bent down and looked in every cage. She looked in Masa's cage, and when she did, she frowned and said no. Then she looked in at Ben, and she frowned and said no. She looked into every cage, and she kept saying no, no, no. Then she bent down and looked into my cage, and she smiled and said yes. And she opened my cage and put an orange dog collar around my neck. And she held out a fig Newton and said, "Good boy." And when I sat up, she put the fig Newton in my mouth. I started to chew the fig Newton. Then the tall lady bent down and patted me on the head, and she said, "Now you're my little pet." And when I looked into the lady's face, it was Mrs. Carp. I sat up in my bed and I grabbed at my neck and I started yelling, "No, no, take this collar off me. I'm not your pet. No, no."